You are a hero in a fantasy world, but as you adventure, you are slowly realizing you are the antagonist. Stop, villain! I shouted, as I sprinted towards the ruffian. He was dressed in judicious finery, his silk shirt contrasting with his scarred and pitted face. A fencing sword hung from his waist, but by his posture I could tell that he preferred knives. He gasped at the sight of me, turning to run down the cobbled alleyway, but he was too slow. I smashed into him and tackled him to the ground. He groaned. Justice is swift. I looked around. The cobbled street was full of people attempting to enter and leave nearby storefronts, with thatched roofs bellowing smoke every few seconds like fat golden dragons. No sign of the princess yet, but I would rescue her from these monsters. I glanced back towards the man, angry at the thought of what he'd done. Where is she? I slapped the man, hard. I couldn't falter, even for an instant, against people like this. A moment's weakness would be enough for them to kill me, perhaps with a hidden knife. All in the name of their disgusting ideology. Where is she? I slapped him harder. A tooth spun out of his mouth and merrily danced across the cobblestones like a ballerina. I don't know, he gasped, eyes brimming with tears. I stood up. Mary finally caught up to me, breathing heavily. Exercise was not her forte. Extracting information was. She was dressed in a black, form-fitting dress, her ice blue eyes dissecting everyone and everything around her, as though we were currently languishing in her dungeon beneath the castle. Does he know anything, Drake? She asked, one eyebrow delicately quirked. I don't think so, I only recognized him from the traitors we saw during the abduction. I spat on the man. He curled into a fetal position, sobbing. Please sir, I don't know anything of use. Spare me, great one, he begged, curled up like a dying spider. Mary eyed him with disgust. Do you want me to take him down to the cells? I'm sure I can extract something from him, she asked me, smirking. Her eyes shone with an eerie light. I shuddered internally. This man was a monster in human form, but I wouldn't let her grab more victims if I could help it. Please sir, please don't let that thing near me. The man locked eyes with me. If I tried to stop Mary from taking him in now, she would likely raise all kinds of hell with the king. I sighed, and raised my hand towards the man, facing palm out. High Gold, I muttered, and the man simply exploded. I was splattered, but somehow Mary was completely untouched. She glared at me. Oops, sadly he resisted arrest. I smirked at her. He was mine, you oaf. Her eyes promised revenge. I shrugged nonchalantly. She growled, and spun on her heels. When you're finished with your little hide-and-seek game, you may join me at the castle. I gave her the finger when I was sure she wasn't looking. Spinning around, I realized that the entire street had stopped to watch this little drama play out. I raised my hands outward, facing away from my body. Nothing to fear, good citizens, only justice being brought to those traitorous terrorists from Kashan, I boomed, smiling reassuringly. A woman nearby clutched her baby closer to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. Splattered blood dripped from her clothes. The baby started crying. I winced. Not a good start to the day. I walked amongst the various stalls of the marketplace. The smell of the hundreds of spices from every far-flung province of the empire assaulted my nose. My contacts told me that the abductors had gone to ground, but that they were still in the city. Time was of the essence. I shuddered at the thought of what they could be doing to the princess. I reached the stall I wanted. It was in the far corner of the marketplace, propped up next to the magically enhanced stone walls of the outer city and covered in an opaque silk sheet, like a tent. Most of the merchants in this place could be called low-level if one was feeling charitable, but the owner of this store was different. Few high-level merchants except Papa bothered to sell their wares outside the imperial inner city. I brushed aside 2 folds of the silk and entered. A decrepit old man sat inside on a wooden chair, his eyes a dark green, like a forest before nightfall. One liver-spotted hand was raised in my direction. Why hello, boy, he murmured. Come to ask Papa for information, have we? Why else would I visit this godforsaken place? I sniffed. It always smelt like a sewer in here. Papa looked offended. He had the right to be. If I had the authority, I would have razed this place to the ground long ago. I heard rumors about what he did to girls who foolishly came here, searching in vain for the name of their true love. Now that's just rude, B. Call me boy again and it'll be the last time you use that slippery tongue, I snapped, interrupting him. I grabbed his neck and effortlessly lifted him off the ground with one arm. Gods, it felt good to do this to scum. He laughed. If you think this is going to intimidate me, you picked the wrong information broker, Drake, he mocked. He had a point. I unceremoniously dropped him onto the floor. I'm glad we understand each other now, I smiled at him. Pap smiled back, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. You want the location of that group that freed the princess, correct? I twitched. Papa chuckled mirthfully. Sorry. I meant to say abducted the princess, I glared at him. He smiled back like a snake. You know full well that she was abducted. The king himself said it, I glared at him. Papa shrugged, and sat back down into his chair. Why would she want to escape from a life of prestige and enjoyment as the queen of the known world? Well, clearly I was misinformed, Papa smirked at me. I didn't rise to the bait. He was well known for giving disinformation and information in equal amounts if he wasn't paid a price for it. Regardless, the price will be quite steep for this one. He leaned forward, mouth twisted in a macabre grin. I grimaced. More girls? I asked. More girls, he winked. I shuddered. The king would undoubtedly agree, and I agreed that the princess had to be found at all costs, but this? Bargaining with this monster? Make your decision soon, Drake, or it could be all for nothing, Papa smirked. That settled it. Yes, I agreed, the Faustian bargain concluded. I reached my hand out and clutched his, feeling as though I'd done something unforgivable. I covered my eyes and squinted as I exited the tent, the sun almost blinding me, before I noticed the change in atmosphere outside. The marketplace was completely silent. Merchants cowered inside their rundown stalls, clutching at their wives as though they were afraid they could slip away at any moment. There were several exceptionally well-muscled, motionless men arrayed in front of me in a semicircle of gleaming chainmail. Their helmets were obsidian, shaped in the likeness of a snarling wolf head. They drunk in the sunlight, casting everything around them into an oppressive monochrome, as if life itself could not bear their presence. The man in the center of the formation swaggered forward, and removed his helmet. His face was sharp and angular, looking as though it could cut through steel plate like butter. His eyes were an unnaturally pale gray, seemingly understanding and piercing into my very soul. "Drake, where's my princess?" He laughed as he walked forward and clasped my outstretched hand. I smiled, glad to see my childhood friend. Prince Jenna had it always being very headstrong. I wondered if his father knew that he was here. "My prince," I bowed. He waved me away. "Please, Drake, we can dispense with formalities here," he grinned boyishly. "I'm only here to talk with you about the abduction." I stared at him skeptically. I once saw him whip a servant boy because he looked him in the eyes. Could Papa be telling the truth? I shook my head. No, I knew Jenna. He would never treat his betrothed that way. Jenna stared at me quizzically. "The search is going well, Pr. Jenna," I corrected. "I have a lead. There's a bookstore along Woodwood Alley. Apparently, a few of the conspirators are in hiding there, sheltered by the owner and his daughters." Several of the men behind Jenna looked at each other and chuckled. I ignored them. Jenna did not. He whirled on them. "Which one of you dared to laugh first?" he shouted, his face a mask of rage. The men swallowed audibly. One stepped forward. "Me." My liege's voice was low and gravelly, almost raw. Jenna put his hand inside his shirt. "Did you know, Drake, that in some older cultures, when a unit failed to show discipline they would give one soldier a short straw, and then force the other men in his unit to beat him to death?" he said, his voice soft, almost gentle as he drew a straw out of his shirt. He handed it to the man, as though he was giving him a commendation, rather than a death sentence. "There we go. Good man. Now, who wants to start?" The men stared at Jenna in silence for several tense moments, and then one lunged forward drawing his baton, perhaps driven by fear, and savagely hit the condemned soldier on the shoulder. The condemned soldier fell to the ground with a meaty smack, and the other soldiers followed. The deed was finished quickly, with barely any screaming. Jenna smiled at me. "The key to maintaining good discipline is fear, my friend. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." I shuddered, unwilling to look at the hunk of meat that had once been a man. A seed of doubt was planted in my mind, industriously destroying the foundations of his trust. Was Jenna capable of hurting the princess? Maybe. Jenna grabbed a horn hanging off his belt, paused for breath and then blew it. It sounded mournful, like the cry of a long-forgotten beast. Something cried out in return, a high-pitched screech that filled my veins with ice. I felt a sense of wrongness in the world, like when Mary was nearby. It sounded as though it should not exist, that I had to kill it immediately or die. A shadow rose over the square, and I gaped as the creature was revealed. An elder worm? I turned to Jenna. His grin was widened as he saw my surprise. "Beautiful, isn't she? I brought her a while back during my travels, but it's taken this long to finally ship over. Captured and tamed by the best." The worm landed in the middle of the square, crushing several storefronts and narrowly missing a few unlucky merchants and their families. It was a dull red, like the color of semi-dried blood. Its black eyes gleamed with a malevolent intelligence, seemingly warning me that if the circumstances were different, I would be fleeing for my life in its mountain lair as it stalked me. A black leather saddle was mounted on its back. "It's great seeing you, Drake, but sadly I have affairs of state to tend to." He winked at me, and I was sure those affairs of state could probably be found at one of the classier establishments in the Whores district. He swaggered his way to the worm, and lifted himself onto it. "Best of luck, Drake. Don't worry, we'll be watching." He mock saluted me, and the worm began to flap its wings, causing great gusts that destroyed more nearby storefronts. I shook my head as he disappeared into the sky, and examined the devastation. Nearby, one of the storefront merchants was sobbing into his wife's arms. One of his sons, a strapping man almost at my height, was clenching his fists as he glared at me. "My good merchant, what's wrong? I'm sure the prince will compensate you for your monetary losses," I consoled him. The merchant opened his mouth, but thought better of it. "Smart man." The wife glared at me, and I was once again grateful that looks could not kill. That storefront was his pride and joy. He spent years working towards it. His son suddenly shouted, his eyes alight with anger. He would spend every dinner with us talking about the new wood he'd used, or the new cloth, and now it's completely ruined. I stepped towards the son menacingly, and he paled. I moved my face inches from his. "The prince will do whatever he wants, and us mere subjects should just be grateful he doesn't decide to kill us for fun," I hissed at him. "Just be glad it was me you shouted at, and not him. Here," I whispered as I slipped several gold crowns into his hands. "That should be enough to compensate for the income and then some, correct?" His eyes widened at the wealth, enough for a lifetime of debauchery. Nodding, he backed away. "Good man," I whispered as I turned away. I had a bookshop to raid.